Welcome to Sound Studies lecture series talk. I don't remember which number. I think this is number 4 of the semester, something like that. We're coming to you from Amsquatchie, Waskahegan, sometimes known as Edmonton, Alberta. We're in Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional homeland of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Inuit, and many other indigenous people. And we like to say sound and music has been heard, created, and celebrated here for thousands of years by many diverse people. And tonight we want to humbly add our sounds to this history with respect and solidarity. So if you haven't been to a Sound Studies Institute talk before and don't know anything about us, we are a research institute at the University of Alberta that is interested in celebrating and supporting research into sound from all angles, including performative and artistic understandings of sound, but also other human and non-human understanding of sound as well. We're interested in all of those things and strive to support as many of those kinds of projects as we can, and in particular, thinking about interdisciplinarity. So I'm really happy to welcome everybody here. I think this is the first talk in this, what is of course Women's History Month, and I hope everyone is enjoying the first part of this month. Tonight's event is one of 2 events that are particularly connected to women's history that will be sponsored, that would be hosting this month. And I want to just quickly tell you about the second one before I introduce this one, because we're very excited to be able to finally host an event in person, and it is a concert of performances. So on Saturday, March 12th, that's coming Saturday, I think, right? Yep, just 3 days from now. We are thrilled to be presenting our annual Winter Roots concert featuring the Women of Folkways. This year, the event will be in person, and you can find information about tickets and so on the Sound Studies website, soundstudies.ca. But we're going to be presenting, we're kind of excited because not only were we able to bring in these great musicians, which include Shauna Caspi, Marie Dunn, Linda McRae, Terry Morrison, and Dana Wiley. We're also able to help fund a little mini tour of this music. So this is we're really privileged to be able to do this. The concerts, there'll be several concerts, including the kind of main concert that I'll be at co-hosting, which will be in the Parkview Community Hall in Northern Alberta. North Edmonton. And you can find out information about those concerts on our website. But I'm really thrilled that we're going to be able to host live concerts this year. This music should not be missed. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. The event will also be presented in an online format that you can, and when you go to Eventbrite to purchase your tickets, you'll see that there's a couple different options, and you can choose to do the online event or do the recorded event after the fact, which will be available for a limited time. Okay, but the first event we have this semester to celebrate Women's History Month is really exciting for me personally, because it's about some music that I happen to love. I'm a big fan of what I call classical electroacoustic music. And one of the things that's been really lovely about, I'd say the last 10 or 20 years really, is that we're finally starting to reap the benefits of the renewed interest in women composers from this era, of which there were many, and they have just been long not acknowledged. I'm thinking of not only composers that we may all know, like Pauline Oliveros and Laurie Anderson, but also Eliane Redig and Delia Derbyshire and Daphne Oram and Marianne Amache, Suzanne Ciani, many, many others. And so I'm always really excited when I learn about these pieces. Oops, it looks like I went muted there for a minute. Everyone still hearing me? I got excited and I pounded on my keyboard. But yeah, so it's often the case when I discover these pieces as a teacher or just as a fan, I find not only that they're really great pieces, but often they're better than the pieces that we always consider as the sort of canonical works that we study. And so I've been really enjoying sort of like strategically taking those out and replacing them with these great works by women composers, and just more and more of them come to light. So tonight, I'm really excited that we have our own Laurel Parsons here, who is a teaching professor in music theory in our department. She's also coordinator of oral skills in the Department of Music. She's also co-authored with Brenda Ravenscroft a series of analytical essays by women composers. I think there's 4 total and 3 are out. A couple of them have won awards. They're just amazing resources. So Laurel has been obviously a longtime advocate for women composers. And I learned that she was looking at this really interesting piece by Elsa Marie Pade, who is often thought of, called the grandmother of Danish electroacoustic music. Her biography and story is so interesting and intriguing, and I don't want to take up any more time giving away this fantastic story. So I'm going to turn it over to Laurel to talk to us about this really incredible, interesting composer, and a couple of particular works, the Magnétophonique and Face It, which is from 1958, and Face It from 1970. So please welcome Laurel Parsons.
Thank you, Scott. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to share my work on this composer who's so little known in North America still. Now, when Scott and I and Tom started talking about the possibility of my giving a talk here, and we were throwing around dates, it was nearly a year ago, and neither of us had any inkling, of course, that by the time I gave this talk, that I would be giving it against the backdrop of war in Europe again. So as I give this talk, I'm keenly aware that sounds of war are traumatizing ordinary people in Ukraine at this moment, as they have traumatized people in Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan and so many other places in recent years. For one brief period, I will be playing Sounds of War. It's about a minute long. So if these are likely to be traumatizing to anyone, you might want to turn off your sound. But as I say, it's just a brief period, and I don't want to exaggerate the effect, but okay. So this is just a comment that I read today on a CBC article about students of color trying to get out of Ukraine, and it's really spoke to me today. That idea of trying to bury every memory and put it in a coffin. And so I want to keep that in mind as I speak. I'm going to begin today by telling you about the listening experience that led me into this research, because it wasn't the usual sort of your intellectual interest gets piqued, as so often happens in academia. It's a story of the power of sound over body and mind. Several years ago, I was Googling around to find composers that we could include in the 4th volume of analytical essays on music by women composers. And among my discoveries was Elsa Marie Pade, a Danish composer who, as Scott said, was referred to as the grandmother of electroacoustic music in Denmark. A few of her compositions were available on YouTube, and one of them, her Symphonie magnétophonique, which was finished in about 1959, was available on YouTube. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting, because for no better reason, it was described as a soundscape of everyday life, a day in the life of Copenhagen in 1958. And I had been in Copenhagen in 1982 for a few days, and I thought, well, this would be interesting, fun kind of time travel exercise to go back and listen to what it might have sounded like in the 50s. Not that I remembered what it sounded like in 1982, but anyway, it sounded like it would be fun. This is a page from the score of the Symphonie magnétophonique. And if you can see on my, behind me on the mantelpiece, you'll see a big yellow coffee table book. The score is published in that yellow coffee table book, along with a bunch of interviews and biography and photographs and a watercolor representation of the piece, a moment by moment watercolor representation of the piece by a Danish artist, which is really interesting. But let's give you an idea of what the piece is like. Here is Pade's description. She says the score has the following sections: morning, alarm clock, polyphonic yawning, toothbrushing in semiquavers, shower, etc. Sections are separated by the signals of the City Hall clock. Forenoon, traffic sounds, work sounds, a barrel organ and other street music, that was then. Noon with the changing of the guard and the radio news. Afternoon with shopping, ladies drinking tea, children playing, rush hour and closing time. Evening with dining and entertainments. Night, sleepers breathing, heartbeats, a light breeze, the natural tone row merging into lark song. Everything has come full circle. A new day begins. So let's listen to the opening 3 minutes. Now, here's me several years ago, the first time I listened to it. Think, okay, this is going to be fun. I put on my headphones, I lie down on my bed, I close my eyes, and I gradually, minute by minute, become more and more immersed in this sound world, which is it's sometimes banal, it's sometimes eerie, it's sometimes comical. So let's listen to those opening few minutes. Okay, so you would have heard some snoring there, some other morning sounds, somebody singing while they're washing up the dishes. And if we continued, you would hear sounds of footsteps going down the stairs and out the door, traffic, trains, buses, bicycle bells, sounds of factory machinery, children singing at school, new news reports on the radio, returning home, and then evening sounds of recreation, dancing, evening in the Tivoli Gardens. So what I'm now going to skip ahead to about 14 minutes in. So what you'll hear is a little bit of calypso, and then things start to take a strange turn. And this is the part that I was talking about a little bit before. So let's listen.
Buona visa. Buona visa.
Now, from this point on, the piece comes to a quiet conclusion, and I'm just going to play the last minute or so. Let's see. So as I listened to this piece for the first time, when I began to hear what sounded like explosions in the background, I was confused. And as that confusion mounted, my heart began to race because I heard a man's loud voice, and then machine gun fire, a bomb exploding, marching army boots, a woman screaming, ambulance and police sirens. You know, intellectually, I knew I was safe in my house, but my body reacted as if I was actually under threat, as if something terrible had happened right outside my house that I couldn't see and I could do nothing to stop. And so this eruption of frightening sounds lasts less than a minute. But on that first listening, they cast a shadow over the remaining quietness of the piece. I couldn't listen to that quiet calm at the end in the same way as I'd listened to it at the beginning. And I couldn't understand it. You know, had I imagined those sounds? Why was the music ignoring this catastrophe that had happened in its world? So my reaction may seem overblown to you, but you were prepared by the title of my talk, and listening to the clip in isolation without having, as I had had that previous 15 minutes, to become totally immersed in that sound world. Nothing I'd read anywhere had suggested that there were sounds in the piece that would seem frightening or out of place or violent. And so I wondered, had I missed something in the descriptions? But for a long time, I could find nothing in any of the descriptions of the piece that described it as anything other than, an ordinary day in Copenhagen in 1958. Not even Pade's own description that I read before. I did eventually find a couple of references. First, in a Wire article by Anna Hilde Nesset, where she mentions that moment representing the composer's war memories, but more importantly, in an interview of Pade in Danish, included in that coffee table book by Danish composer Jacob Getz. And here's how she responds to a question from him about him asking her to confirm his impression that her goal in composing musique concrète was to present soundscapes of the everyday world, but manipulated to highlight to listeners just how amazing that soundscape is. And so she says, yes, so it doesn't become documentary or social realistic, because it's not me. There must be a little adventure and a little smile, and there must also be the eerie, such as the world. Suddenly there in the evenings and at night, it goes out with this cries and screams and ambulances and explosions, etc. And that, most people think, are war memories on my part, but it is not. Just before that sequence gets underway, there's a newspaper boy yelling, "Morning newspapers!" And then you hear what's in the newspaper. But the funniest thing, after all, there's a funny story, and she goes on to talk about something that she finds funny about her piece. And what I'd missed, not being a Danish speaker, is that when you hear that man's voice say, "Mona Visa," that's not a threat. It literally means morning news. And what I'd heard as machine gun fire, I learned when I looked at the score, was actually the sounds of a printing press. So not realizing I was supposed to interpret the sounds of violence as just something someone was reading in the news, I grossly overreacted, or so I thought. And in an instant, my pet theory about it being her war trauma resurfacing had been just instantly punctured. And then her cheery comments framing that statement, there must be a little adventure and a little smile, there's a funny story, seemed designed to prevent anyone from taking those sounds of terror and war seriously. And yet, now I need to tell you something about Pade and how she became Denmark's first electroacoustic composer. She was born Else Marie Jensen in 1924, and as a child suffered from a painful kidney condition involving the recurrence of infections and high fevers. So she was frequently bedridden, and during these long periods of forced inactivity would entertain herself by listening to and creating imaginary worlds around the sounds that she heard around her. And I'm going to quote her reminiscences at length here because in her lists of sounds, We can recognize things we've heard in the symphony already, and because it reveals so much about her relationship to sound throughout her life. Right up to the age of 13, these kidney infections reappeared at regular intervals, and I had to stay in bed for long periods. But it turned out that in a sense, this minimalistic world I was in contained just as many sensory impressions as a spectacular world in which the busy, active people moved. It was like being a drop in the ocean. From morning to evening, there was life and sound around me. The day started for me with morning sounds, sponges with splashing and dripping in the washstand, the kettle whistling, the birds also whistling if the rain wasn't pouring down, different footsteps, friendly words, and temperature-taking songs. The days passed. You can't see my own. Sorry. The days passed with reading aloud and toys when the worst of the fever was over, and the radio played for me and read to me and explained things. When the window was opened, I could hear carpet beating, the caretaker sweeping the yard, and the children playing. Sometimes I came into the living room for a while and sat on the sofa. There were quite different sounds there. Heavy horses' hooves on the paving stones, horses and carts that arrived with bread from the baker opposite, horses for this and horses for that, and bicycle bells. There was a confusion of sounds, the street vendors' cries, and much else. Elsewhere, she recalls weeping inconsolably when her mother sang a particular Danish Christmas carol, and I was able to track that down. And let's listen to the first few seconds of it. You hear the melancholy in this tune. It's easy to imagine how a child with such sensitivity to sound might have responded so intensely. The sensitivity to sound and music was one of the childhood influences that led to her becoming a composer. The other was her fascination with the little puzzles and games that her father would bring home to entertain her while she was sick, including a glass bead game that gave her the title of one of her early electronic compositions. And we can see this impulse towards composition in the continuation of her memoirs. She says, I learned very quickly that some of the sounds came at a particular time of day in a particular order every day. I also learned that during the day, the sun could make the birds sing, while the moon could not make the stars say anything, although it looked as though they would like to. They twinkled. All that could be heard at night was bird calls and the moaning of the wind, cats meowing, and the sirens of ambulances now and then. So then I decided to give the stars some sounds of their own. I formed tiny little tingly sounds with my lips, and the man in the moon, whom I firmly thought I could see, laughed back at me, a deep, friendly laughter. In her interview with Getz, Pade observes, I could use everyday sounds around me to make stories, and it made me feel safe. But that safety was short-lived. Here she is as a teenager. On April 9th, 1940, she was 15 years old when Hitler's army, navy, and air force attacked Denmark. Tiny Denmark's forces were no match for Germany. And so after only a 6-hour battle, the Danish king and government surrendered, and they entered into a deal that would allow the Danes to continue managing their domestic affairs while the Germans occupied their country for the next 5 years. Denmark, in that way, escaped the worst consequences of the war, but soon they were still under constant threat by the German occupiers. By 1943, when Elsa Marie was 19, the Germans had occupied Denmark for 3 years. As a troop of soldiers marched by her on the street one day, she spat at them. This wasn't the first time she'd done this, but this time was different because before she'd been ignored, this time one of the soldiers broke ranks and started to chase her. She ran through the streets to the safety of her piano teacher's house. By the time she arrived, she'd lost him, But her piano teacher was not sympathetic. Her piano teacher was angry with her, scolded her for putting herself at risk, her family at risk. And she said, if you're going to do this, you must do it properly. And that's when Elsa Marie found out that her piano teacher led a secret life as a member of an all-women Danish resistance group. So Elsa Marie joined the group and was soon being trained in surveillance, weapons, and explosives. This small group of women was working and training in anticipation of the hoped for invasion of the Allies who would rescue them from the German occupation. And their role within the larger Danish resistance was going to be to blow up communication lines between German headquarters to prevent them being able to obviously communicate if and when the Allies arrived. In the meantime, Elsa Marie and another teenage girl in the group would go and they would conduct reconnaissance. They would go into German compounds and they pretend to be lost. The German soldiers would see these giggling teenage girls, and one of them would bend over to tie her shoe, and they would take no notice. But they didn't realize that the girls, as they were doing this, were memorizing the layout of the compound, observing things like the locking systems that lock the gates and various doors and so on. And then they would go home and pass that information on to the greater resistance group. But Elsa Marie never got the chance to blow anything up. One morning in 1944, in September, she was awakened by her mother's frantic voice and the sound of hammering. The Gestapo had arrived at the family's flat and were demanding to see her teenage daughter. The mother had no idea that her daughter was doing any of this. Now, here is a screenshot. This is of Google Street View of the building where she lived with her parents. This is the main entrance here where the Gestapo would have entered. But as you can see, the building's on a corner. And then my next shot, I'll show you around the corner. Where did it go? Here we go. Now you can see this door here. There is a back exit to this building. And right here in the red box, there's a little shop. And so Elsa Marie told her mother, stall the Germans. She threw on a sweater. She snuck out the apartment down the back entrance and, back exit, went down the back stairs and went into this little shop and asked for, quick, give me a coat, give me a basket with some milk bottles in it. So this is what her account of what happened next. Oh, not yet there, not there yet. Okay, so here's how she describes what happens next. A little later, I walked as carefree as possible out the shop door and down the 3 steps. I was seized in the arm by a German soldier who asked where I was going. Milk, I replied, pointing into the basket. The soldier now took out a picture of me, taken on the street, happily chatting with a friend. As he did so, I ran as fast as I could down the sidewalk until there was a shot. I threw myself head over heels onto my stomach while the curve of milk sailed into its own lake. I lay there that way, but only for a moment. Then I was picked up, not by one, but by 2 soldiers. She says a lot of emotions swirled through my head, body, and soul. Afraid, of course, but also many other things. Furious, embarrassed to have been stopped by a scare shot, so a warning shot, humiliated at the treatment I received, handcuffed and kicked, but also a strange curiosity. The scare shot had split me in 2, one who acted and one who watched. This description comes from her contribution to a little book, called No Tea Party, Were We Terrorists? On a group of women in the resistance. And it includes reminiscences from Lund, Pade, and other surviving members about their work, their arrest, their imprisonment by the Germans. And from that moment, she was a prisoner of the Germans for the next 8 months, until the end of the war in May 1945. In her contribution to this book, she provides a sonically rich description of the first few weeks of her captivity at Gestapo headquarters at the University of Aarhus. This is the city where she lived. At first, she was held alone in a small cell and periodically brought to the commandant's office for frightening and violent interrogations. The other members of her group were also, they had been arrested. They were also held at the university, but she didn't get to see them very often, only when they were taken out for exercise walks. On occasion, they managed to connect with each other even when they couldn't see each other through sound. They had a whistling signal, the Chopin E major étude, or Danish songs. They would start singing Danish songs that the Germans would not understand. Pade's account is full of sounds, such as the guard dogs barking or gobbling their food, the guards shouting Heil Hitler, the commandant's metallic voice. She describes it like a cello played col legno. Slaps and blows of interrogation, the jingle of the guards' keys, or the rhythmic beat of their marching boots. One day, the commandant suggested that reading Mein Kampf might change her thinking and make things go better for her. She replied politely that she'd found something else to keep her busy, namely composing music. She didn't have any paper or pencils, but she had ripped the metal clasp off her garter belt and used it to scratch out notes on the wall of her cell. The commandant erupted in rage, shouting threats of retaliation against her, against her family, for defacing her cell. And that night, in desperation, she took toothpaste and she patched the scratches on the wall. And then she took that little metal clip and she scraped plaster powder off the floor and then covered up the scratches, the toothpaste with the powder. And she must have done a good job because the commandant was satisfied. A few days later, a mysterious package arrived from the Red Cross, and in it were staff paper and pencils. And she later learned that the commandant had been a cellist in a German orchestra. Now, in her Wire, in an essay that she was published by Pade, published in the Wire, she recalled, there we go. One night when everything was chaos in my mind, I screamed out loud in fear and helplessness in my solitary cell, but no one came. It was then I promised myself that if I survived this, I would work with music for the rest of my life. And then I felt a strange calm. Light, warmth, and love were all around me. Elsewhere, when she tells the story, she talks about looking at the window and seeing a star. I was no longer alone. This was the turning point in my life. One night in October, the women were chained together, loaded onto cattle cars, and transported from Aarhus to Fröslev, a prison camp near the German border, where they were held for the rest of the war. Shortly after their transfer, the RAF, the RAF bombed the Gestapo headquarters where they had been held. They killed the commandant and burned all the Gestapo records detailing the activities of Pade and her group. Now, Fröslev, you can see in the little map there, very close to the German border. It was an improvement over the conditions in the Aarhus Gestapo headquarters. The food was provided by the Danish Red Cross, and since the women were housed in barracks, she wasn't alone anymore. It was not a death camp. There were no, the worst of the experience was the boredom. There were no executions at Fröslev. At the same time, they didn't know that the Allies would eventually win or that they would survive. And they lived under the constant threat that misbehavior would get them sent down into Germany to the much harsher camps of Ravensbrück or Neuengamme, where indeed many were sent and lost their lives. The loss of the records in the RAF bombing may have saved them from that fate. While in Fröslev, Pade composed songs to keep the other prisoners' spirits up. Now remember, she's only 19 at this point. She turned 20 in the camp. And so here I wanted to play for you a little bit of some of the pieces that she composed while she was there. So here's one called You and I and the Stars. I'll listen to a little bit of that. And let's listen to a little bit of this one. So, you know, the little song with About the Stars, there's a tinge of melancholy in it, but it's basically a happy sounding song. And the Svingsco kind of recalls, I think, her times before she was arrested in high school, where she would play in the school jazz band for dances. The other women in their memoirs of Fröslev recalled her jokes and her sense of fun while she was there, despite a terrible period where she had appendicitis, but there was no way of being operated on. While she was there, she met a male prisoner by the name of Henning Pade, who she would marry after the war. She and the rest of the prisoners were freed on the liberation of Denmark, as I said, in May 1945. After the war, she entered the Royal Danish Academy of Music, where she studied composition with von Humboldt and Jan Maegard. But it was not until 1952, when she was transfixed by a Radio France broadcast about the musique concrète of Pierre Schaeffer, that she realized there was another composer who thought about sound the way she did and could lead her in new directions. Sorry, I see something in the chat. Oh, yeah, they're great songs. Where was I? Okay, so she went to Paris. She studied with Schaeffer for a while, and then she returned to Denmark, where she found work in the Danish National Radio, which gave her access to equipment and sound engineers who were much greater boost to her career than anyone in the Danish compositional community at that time. She began work on the Symphonie magnétophonique in 1958, 13 years after the end of the war. Decades later, in her interview with Getz, she discussed the work of Penderecki and others who explicitly evoked memories of war in her music. She said, "I like that music evokes good moods. It may be violent, but it should not be. I've never been noisy." And when I heard Penderecki and others' expressions of war music, I understood that was what people were. They could use electronic music for that, and they were right. But then I thought there was also the supernatural, and there I go, because I used it to help in my childhood. What I want to do is make oases, because I think reality is a grim spectacle. And I thought that as a kid too. I gathered good, beautiful and good things that could form a defense when the world got too tight. And so again, we see in her words this conception of sound as something that provided a sense of security and something that as an adult composer she could use to offer listeners relief from that grim spectacle of reality. Now, when Pade denied that the sounds of violence in the symphony represented her own memories, she was speaking her truth, and in the absence of evidence to the contrary, it would be inappropriate to insist that they represent the eruption of repressed trauma that she wasn't prepared to admit at the time. But I'm struck by the resemblance between that brief sonic eruption of war in the symphony and Louise Marshall's concept of the sonic artifact, discussed in her 2018 dissertation based on interviews with post-war female experimental composers. When she interviewed Eliane Radic, who Scott mentioned earlier, Marshall observed how when she would quote a short phrase habitually used by her mother when she was a child to demand her obedience, goes, "Hey, Eliane," her body language would stiffen as if the sound of that phrase still exerted traumatic power over her. And the recurrence of similar sonic eruptions in other interviews led Marshall to call these moments sonic artifacts. She links this idea with observations of what oral historians Michel Mouton and Helena Poland McCormick call boundary crossings, similarly unexpected eruptions in the midst of rather ordinary stories that they witnessed in their interviews with elderly German women reminiscing about their lives in Nazi Germany, and Black South African women who had survived the Soweto uprising. And these historians write, quote, "Such a combination of the mundane and the self-revealing may be the consequence of speech patterns or habits. More disconcertingly, they may be a signal of a proclivity, especially among women, but perhaps also among other historically subordinated groups, to be embarrassed to reveal something about the self and therefore to downplay personal experience or feelings," end quote. Marshall also cites the work of French psychoanalyst and music therapist Edith Lecour, who argued that every person has a sonic identity composed of sonic phenomena bearing both measurable acoustic traits and historical, familial, or cultural meaning. From this, Lecour developed the idea of the self-sound interval. Marshall's discussion of Lecour resonates with the integral role of sound in Pade's identity and with that sonic rupture in the symphony. Marshall writes, "For the self-sound interval to be analyzed, it follows that the body is a sonically situated entity. It is surrounded by sound, and it recognizes the interplay of interior and exterior sounds. Lecour's formulation allows for the possibility of that body's sonic integrity being torn by sound sources outside it. Crucially, she does not consider that this rupture could come from within the body, that is, through that person's own telling." And I've mentioned, the descriptions of Pade's personality by others paint a portrait of a teenager and much later an old lady. Where's my old lady pictures? Who was cheerful and humorous, as we can see in these photos here. She had a extraordinarily high and bird-like voice. And the references to her as the grandmother of Danish electroacoustic music perpetuate this caricature of a sweet and cheerful old lady. But in editor Marianne Elenius's introduction to No Tea Party, she explains that the version of Pade's memoirs that she included in the book was actually the third version of events that Pade had written down. In 1976, 31 years after her release from Fröslev, she sunk into a period of debilitating depression and anxiety. Her psychologist believed she was suffering a delayed response to her wartime experiences, a phenomenon that was widespread enough among surviving prisoners of war that it was termed the 30-year crisis. As part of her treatment, the psychologist recommended that she write down everything that had happened to her. So that was the first version. 4 years later, she created a second version that, in Pade's own words, was, quote, "written on the basis of another more bleakly colored description, but the period of time between the first and second versions has been a gain for the more comically colored shades, which was an equally great truth." The third version, the only one that Pade was willing to make public, she did not write until 2001, 25 years after that first bleakest version, which she destroyed. So what this tells us is that she didn't tell us everything, and that her darkest memories of her imprisonment likely went with her to her grave. And it also suggests that it wasn't until the nearly 20 years after the composition of the symphony that she was ready to articulate those memories. And it's worth remembering too that those sounds in the symphony were not just sounds that she herself had heard during the war. She had made them when she screamed at night alone in her cell and was answered by silence. I mean, the implications of her bracketing those sounds as merely news, when her own experience of these sounds was not that far in the past, and certainly they were not far in the past for the Danish, her earliest Danish listeners. There's just so much to unpack there. But what I want to do now is turn to a composition that she wrote in 1970 called Face It, because it explicitly enacts a battle between memory and denial, and because its relevance for us in 2022 cannot be denied. The title, Face It, the actual Danish the title translates to "we must see with our eyes," and it's idiomatically, that is a phrase that is used by Danes when they're confronting someone who is in denial. In stark contrast to the symphony, Face It uses only 4 sounds. The first is a relentless drum beat that persists throughout the entire 8-minute piece. The second is a Danish male voice speaking one of 2 sentences in Danish. The first is that title phrase, "we must see with our eyes," and the second is "Hitler ikke død," Hitler is not dead. The third sound is difficult to make out at first. In the early minutes, we hear brief, scratchy interruptions like radio static, but as the piece progresses, these interruptions gradually lengthen until we realize what we're hearing is the distorted voice of Adolf Hitler. Here I'd like to thank Gregor Kokorts, our colleague here, who was able to identify the speech that we hear from Hitler as his speech to the Reichstag on July 13th, 1934, as he justified what is now known as the Night of the Long Knives, in which he had 90 of his perceived enemies executed. This is the ending, what you hear at the end, the last thing that Hitler says in this piece. He's basically, his message to the assembled people is, this is what's going to happen to you if you think you can be disloyal to me. So I'm going to, at this point, I think I'm going to get out of this one, yes. I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to go to new share. I hope you can see that. This is an audio timeline of the piece. And as you can see here, the piece is in 4 phases, pardon me. At the beginning, the end bubbles are the narrator, the yellow ones are Hitler. And so our first phrase is the longest, about 3 minutes and 11 seconds. We hear, "we must see with our eyes," and then Hitler, we start to hear these little, the "Hitler is not dead" over and over and over again. And then we start to hear the scratchiness. So let's listen to a bit of that.
Se i øjnene. Hitler ikke død. 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 Hitler ikke død.
Now, as you can see by looking at these bubbles, these alternations get faster and faster as you go through this phase. When we get to phase 2, It's a similar thing happening, but Hitler's phrase segments become more intelligible. The narrator's voice raises to a more urgent tone, and we'll listen to a bit of that.
I må se i øjnene. Hitler er ikke død. Hitler er ikke død. Hitler er ikke død.
When we get to phase 3,
Hitler er ikke død. Hitler er ikke død. Hitler er ikke død.
and you can hear that increased anxiety. When we get to this little black point here, the narrator's voice suddenly drops.
Hitler. 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 Hitler.
And so the narrator is as if he's giving up the fight almost, and Hitler's words are getting longer and longer. Then we get to the final few seconds. Now Hitler has won, and we hear that ending of the speech that I showed you before. And then at the end, we hear a fourth sound, the most chilling of all for me, and that is the roar of the crowd. So in Face It, written in 1970, as she was about to head into those years of debilitating depression, she does not give her listeners that oasis of protective sound. Piece looks backwards and forwards in time. Looking back, it enacts that conflict in the human psyche between the repression and eruption of traumatic memory here in the form of Hitler's voice and the atrocities that it unleashed. But Face It also faces forward, demanding its modern listeners to see with open eyes Hitler, the man, may be dead, but the forces of hate in the crowds that emboldened and empowered him are not. And if we close our eyes and turn away, they will win again. Now, 3 months ago, when I wrote the abstract of what I was going to say today, I anticipated having time to discuss these pieces in the context of the trauma studies literature, especially as it pertains to music. There's wonderful, moving books by Maria Sismic on music and trauma in post-war Eastern Europe, Amy Lynn Wlodarski's book on musical witness in the Holocaust, and Gillian Rogers on music, trauma, and healing in France between the world wars. And I can also mention here Nick Raylan's work on Ludoslavsky. But Pade is still so unfamiliar here that her story, so rich in sonic significance, needs to be told before this kind of discussion can really truly begin. And I look forward to being able to expand on the critical framework of this project in writing, where this story, with its many branches reaching out in so many different disciplines and directions, can take its time to unfold in full. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Laurel. That was really fascinating and moving. So I know that we're at 8 o'clock, and so and if for those of you who have to go ahead and leave, I thank you all for coming. We will stay for a few more minutes though for questions if anyone has them. So at this point, I'd like to invite anyone in the audience to ask a question. You can type your question in the chat, or you can also make it known that you'd like to unmute yourself and speak, and we can take questions that way too. So I'll open the floor.
Mariam is going to give me a hard time.
Question from Mariam, please.
Hi, Laurel.
Hi, Mariam.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much. You told me a little bit about this when this project was, in Nuce. It was just beginning to form itself, and so it's really lovely to hear the fruition. I don't know if I'm sort of sticking my foot too far, but I mean, I wasn't born in World War II, I mean, I wasn't. And so in my life, that has always been the stuff of reels and mechanical reproduction and so on. And it also represents for me a kind of, a world trauma of the past that has, unfortunately, that keeps continuing in different shapes. And I wonder about that because, in part, like one of the themes that you were pursuing in this paper was I think about how that memory of trauma changes. That memory, so that raw memory is not necessarily what you want to. What you want to present, and that there has to come something else, and so you have this softness, and then you end with this, like, really, like, sort of. It's hard to imagine anything more facing it. I mean, more in your face, more brutal, more crude, more. I mean, less anything, no frills, and so. And I just wonder if you could tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are about, the way in which trauma evolves, and this very surprising way that hers evolved, in 1970, I mean, do you read it as a return? Do you read it as, I'm saying evolution of trauma, but I don't know. How do you read it? Anything around that? I didn't articulate a question, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Well, I mean, these are such I can't even think of the word, such loaded questions. Loaded is not the word I want, but rich is too positive, but you know what, I hope you know what I mean. Complex. It's a strange situation. I wish I had more access to her own memories. I think, in a sense, cheerfulness was her brand. And if you hadn't read this tiny little Danish coffee tape, sorry, it's not that one, the little tiny one, you would never know that there was this darkness inside her, at least for a period of time. She seems to have regained her cheerfulness after she went through therapy. But I think also there's that part about wanting to put it, the kind of bracketing it, saying, okay, it's okay, this is just news. Yeah. And what does that say? If, oh, okay, it's just news, it doesn't matter. And when we're seeing these types of things in the news every day today, and how are we to and I don't know how she evolved. There's just so much that we don't know about. I would love to be able to see any papers that she, her archives, and I haven't been able to find whether there doesn't seem to be much, if anything, in the Danish archives at this point. Mm-hmm. She died about 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it may be just too soon, I don't know. But it's about, and I think another aspect of this, Mariam, is that she was if you were going to be in a prison camp run by the Germans in World War II, Frøslev was the best one to be in, perhaps. She did not suffer the atrocities that millions of Jews suffered in the death camps. And as the Nuremberg trials proceeded, she must have felt something about that. I think that how could you complain about the experience she had in light of everything that did happen to people that was so much worse. So I think perhaps that also plays into it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's.
Maybe I'll pose a question or two following up on that, because I don't see any others anyway, and I'm so curious about these pieces. So Laurel, one thing I really appreciated about your analysis, I appreciated that you were trying to, especially with this first piece, I mean, it's clear that the second piece, face it, she's facing it. and it is not intended to be a safe space. It's intended to, you know, wake us up and pull us out of our stupor or something. I don't know. It's really quite a remarkable piece in that way, compared to the way that she positions herself, I guess, as you put it. But what I find interesting about that first piece, I agree with you. I listened to the whole thing. I've listened to it a couple times, maybe a few times. What I note about it is, I mean, on the one hand, there's a sort of eeriness to the whole piece, which of course is something that I always have to remind myself and also my students that eeriness, the sort of technological eeriness, is really more about sort of the technology of the time that's been co-opted by horror movies and things today, right? I mean, there's just a whole sort of litany of sort of vintage audio sounds that are now associated with the creepy and the gloomy, which was never the way it would have been heard in the 1950s. But nevertheless, that piece, to my ear, even discounting those things, I do hear trauma in that piece, especially in that moment, especially as it creeps up on you, because other thing that I find interesting about that piece is its length. It's 20 minutes long. And pieces from that period, electroacoustic music pieces from that period, typically were either really short, and of course that was partly because a lot of the composers were meticulously creating these structures that were just very difficult to do and time consuming, or they were really long and made up of processes and or drone and or other kinds of things where the time frame is not as important. But this piece is not like either of those things. It's very episodic, and it was interesting to read your description that she wrote about the piece, which I didn't think of it that way at all, but I could definitely feel the safety factor that she was trying to invoke in the piece. Anyway, I guess my question, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I just found this so fascinating. But one thing I was really wondering about was, were you able to find out anything about the original performance context of this piece and how it was intended to be initially perceived? I know that a lot of works from this period either went straight to radio or they were conceived for a particular event, often with multiple channels and other kinds of things like that. And probably this, I do think this was maybe later released in some form, but I don't think it was probably originally created for that, especially in 1957. Do you happen to know that, or did you find anything about how it was originally to be conveyed?
If I recall correctly, it was for radio. She had done an earlier piece that was similar, shorter. Her first sort of soundscape composition was, I think, an amusement park in not Tivoli Gardens, but some other amusement area in Denmark that had been on radio. And so I think that was similar to this, because she was working for the Danish radio at the time. And she did it in collaboration with one of the Danish national radio engineers.
Interesting. Okay, the reason I was asking about that is that if it hadn't been for radio, there may indeed have been some other components in terms of other media involved, and that opens up all kinds of interesting questions. But it doesn't sound like that was the case. But anyway, yeah, I really appreciate that you're trying to dig into it in that way, and because I do feel, and I think I also agree in my own experience analyzing pieces and getting to know pieces, especially by women from this early period, is true, is it seems like there was a tendency to not write deeply about the work, or to get, to sort of try to hide. I mean, I even think about pieces like Pauline Oliveros's Bye Bye Butterfly, which we always talk about as, because the way she wrote about it as a piece that's sort of about saying goodbye to tonality and sort of concerned with musical evolution. But in fact, there may have been much more to that piece, given her that she was a lesbian composer who was out in a period when that was not common, and there may have been many other sort of layers to that piece that she just didn't talk about. And so I appreciate that you're trying to dig this out, and I hope that some more information comes out about these pieces.
Well, thank you. I think it's one of the things that struck me when I was reading Pierre Schaeffer, when he talks about the reduced listening of hearing these sounds devoid of any meaning, not thinking about their origins. And his language is quite violent. He talks about sort of ripping the meaning away from the sound. And she subscribed to that idea, but you cannot listen to that piece and divorce. You kind of listen to it as if, oh, okay, I'm hearing counterpoint between the whistling kettle and the singing voice, or whatever, or between the dog barking and the bird. But you cannot divorce the image of what's going on, especially in the scream. And apparently there's a special part of the brain that screams activate.
Yeah.
That makes it impossible to ignore them. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much there that I would love to explore with the
Well, thank you for that. I'll maybe just ask if there might be one final question before we wrap up tonight. Okay, well, I thank you again, Laurel, for this wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to the next, whatever comes next out of this research. I'll definitely be interested in following along. And for those who are interested in making some noise now, please feel free to unmute yourself and give Laurel some applause.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for this opportunity to try this out, to share this with you. Well.
All right, thanks everyone. And hopefully maybe we'll see some of you on Saturday night at the Women of Folkways concert. I'm really excited about that. I will be there. It will be one of my first live events, so I'm excited and a little nervous, but I'll be there. All right, see everyone. Thank you. Have a good night.